Hey guys, Danny Johnson here, and today I wanted to make a video on spark plugs. I think they're often an overlooked part of any engine build or even just operating your car normally. And so we'll get into it, and I'll first start off by just talking about the plug itself and what you have. So down here at the beginning of the plug, you have what's called the ground electrode, or I've even heard of it being called the ground strap. And then right in front of that you have the center electrode here, and basically that's what's making the connection as it sparks. And so then right after that you have the insulator nose here, and then you get into the threads. This is how it actually threads into the cylinder head. You have a gasket here at the very front. You have the metal shell itself right here, and then you have what's called the hexagon, or basically this is where the spark plug wrench will attach to the plug and be able to screw it in. You have an insulator in here underneath that you cannot see from here, and then you have your top insulator here, and then you have these corrugations here that basically help in the cooling process, and then you have the terminal nut on the very top, which is where the ignition lead or the coil pack will attach to give it power. So basically I wanted to talk a little bit about these plugs because there's a lot that you need to consider when you're thinking about switching your spark plugs out. Typically they're going to last about 100,000 miles, but depending on what engine you have and what pressures they're seeing, they could last as little as 10,000 or even less miles. So it's something to definitely keep in mind. But the purpose of a spark plug is to ignite the air-fuel mixture within the cylinder, and the key to that is that it ignites it at the proper time. You don't want it to ignite too soon or too late. And so a lot of that has to do with the car's ignition timing, but it also has to do with the fuel that you're running and how much ignition timing is in it, so that basically the detonation happens properly. You don't want to have pre-detonation where it explodes too soon, and you don't want to have a lack of detonation where it basically doesn't explode at all. The good thing about spark plugs is as they go into the top of the cylinder head, it gives you basically a way of taking them out and looking down into the cylinder and examining the piston and everything if you happen to have a borescope. And also the plug itself, as you can see, can tell a story of what's actually happening inside the engine. And so we'll get into that a little bit later as well. But spark plugs can be a great diagnostic tool as you pull them and look them over, and you can see if the engine's running too lean or too hot, or if it's running too rich, which would be too cold and getting carbon buildup. Basically, it's important to know that the common operating range is 932 degrees Fahrenheit to 1472 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if you're operating anything over 1472 degrees, you may see pre-ignition, or detonation as it's called, where basically the fuel in the engine will explode before it's supposed to. As these get so hot, they turn into basically a glow plug and can pre-ignite that fuel. So one thing I want to point out, which is commonly overlooked, is that spark plugs have different heat ranges. And so the heat range, a lot of people think that, oh, that's how hot it must burn, as you see the flame at the bottom, but that couldn't be any farther from the truth. The heat range is actually the temperature that each of these plugs is designed to operate. And so as you have a lower number, it's a hotter plug, and as you go to the higher numbers, it's a colder operating range plug. Okay, so for example, on this far side over here, this is a plug out of my 2003 Mustang Mach 1, and its heat range is let's see, is a 4. So it's operating basically at a lower temperature. This plug here is what's intended to go into my Mustang Cobra, which is supercharged. Now the supercharged will step up from a 4 to a 5, and this one's even a 6 that I run, so it's even a step colder. And then if you are really running a lot of boost pressure out of a supercharger or a turbocharger, then you'll step into the 7 heat range. Now it's important to know that you have pros and cons to each of these. And you have to remember that as they operate at different temperatures, you're going to have different side effects. So for example, with a colder plug over here on this side, that would be for an engine that's developing a lot of heat and pressure from a big turbocharger or a lot of boost from a supercharger. And what you're basically trying to get away with is a plug that's going to operate cooler in order to not have negative side effects like pre-igniting the fuel before it's supposed to. On the other hand, you would want a hotter operating plug over here on a car that's going to not be as high performance, that you're going to drive every day, you know, something that isn't going to need to have to stay too cool. You have to think about these plugs as if they're engine oil in a way. And what I mean by that is engine oil, as you know, has to heat up to a certain temperature to lubricate properly. So if you're running engine oil too cold, it's thicker, it's more, you know, it's less viscous, and basically it will not lubricate the way it's supposed to. So think about that as well with plugs. If you have plugs that are burning, you know, that are operating very, very cold on a normal engine, then the engine probably will not operate properly. Then again, if you have a plug that operates too hot in a situation where there's a lot of heat and pressure, then the fuel can pre-ignite and you can have other issues. So that's something to keep in mind. Some of the factors that they used in order to change these heat ranges, a lot of it has to do with this insulator nose here. How long it protrudes out, how wide it is, how thick it is, how far it goes in. Basically that's going to determine how hot the plug is staying. And so basically a longer, bigger nose is going to hold in more heat. So on a colder plug, this insulator nose here is going to be a little bit smaller. Okay, how thermally conductive it is also going to make a difference. Basically, if a lot of these, if they're copper, you know, what kind of metal that they're using is going to determine it. Okay, now when deciding on a plug, here's a few things you want to think about. First of all, your engine speed and load. So basically, if you have your daily driver that you're starting up and driving long distance or short distances to work in, you're just putting around town, you're going to want to go with a hotter plug. The reason why is because you have to basically clean the plugs each time you drive them, is a way of thinking about it. And so as your car operates, if you're just taking short trips to the store and, you know, driving around town, then it's not going to get very hot. Now, until it reaches about 800 degrees Fahrenheit, it's not going to start cleaning. It's going to start fouling the plugs, actually. And so 842 degrees is the self-cleaning carbon range temperature. So if you're just putting around town and you're not going to be getting the car very hot, you want a hotter plug so that it can get to that 842 degree range and start burning the carbon buildup that comes on here. However, if you're doing a lot of towing, if you have a supercharged car, you're running down the track, you're getting it really hot, then that's not going to be a problem. So you want to step down to a colder plug. So basically that's something to consider when you're deciding on which plugs. Also, the air-fuel ratio that your car is running is very important. If you have a very rich situation, like say it's supercharged or turbocharged and you're on the safe side and you're running it really rich, the temperature is going to drop within the cylinders. Basically, fuel cools an engine if you have a lot of it. So basically, if you're running really, really rich, then you're going to want to stay kind of in the middle here with a somewhat warm plug so that it can burn that off. If your car is running lean, then it's going to be just the opposite. So just keep that in mind, that a lean means that you're burning it really, really hot, and now you're introducing risks of the fuel pre-igniting and all kinds of things. So if it's running lean, you're going to want to go a little bit cooler. Also with, you know, basically pressures that are inside the cylinders, kind of like what we talked about. A supercharged or turbocharged car should be in this range over here in the cooler step. And so remember, this is a 4, 6, and 7 range here, and basically the higher number, the cooler the operating temperatures are designed for these. Okay, if you have low quality fuel or low octane and you hear knocking and pinging, then that's going to be kind of a giveaway to you that you may be running too hot. Okay, so that's something else to think about. Ignition timing is very important. As you increase ignition timing to try to make some more horsepower, just remember that every 10 degrees of ignition timing is going to increase the temperature within the cylinder by about 158 degrees to 210 degrees Fahrenheit. So as you start to increase ignition timing, you want to step down to a colder plug. But remember, like we were talking about, you don't want to just jump to the coldest plug that's on the market. The car may not operate well. In fact, I've had a friend with a Cobra who threw some 7s in it and said that it would start up and it would misfire and run like crap until the car started to heat up. So just keep that in mind. Cars with a higher compression ratio, you're gonna have more cylinder pressure. So once again, you're gonna be leaning towards the cooler plugs, just because you're creating a lot more heat. Forced induction turbocharged cars, the same thing. You're creating so much more pressure and heat inside those cylinders that you're going to want to be going to the colder plugs. These TR6s are very common, by the way. They're kind of in the middle grounds, unless you're running a huge turbo or a lot of boost, then you're going to probably want to be right here in the middle. And nitrous oxide, kind of the same thing. Nitrous is going to increase that temperature in the cylinders, so you're going to want to make sure that you're keeping a cooler operating temperature. Atmospheric pressure, cylinder pressure, as that decreases, as altitude increases, so spark plug the tip temperature may also start to decrease, so you want to keep that in mind. Just remember that fouling more easily occurs basically as you're running a lot more thick more thick air-fuel ratio. And basically, as you see on the front of this plug here, what had happened is you have a lot of oil getting past the rings. This engine needs a rebuild, but if you haven't seen our compression test video, then it's just a few videos back that we did. This came out of that car. You can see oil was getting past it and really causing some fouling issues. Let's see, basically, if your car starts misfiring and you notice you're driving down the road and you're feeling it jolt a bit, a good thing to do is pull the plugs, just as a way of kind of looking them over and trying to figure out if by looking at them, if you can see anything. If they're a bright white color and they've been running lean, you know that you're not getting enough fuel. If they're gunked up like this, the car could be running too rich, or you could have oil getting into the combustion chamber. So anyway, that's just something to think about. Carbon fouling, basically, as we talked about, if you're operating under 842 degrees in the cylinders, then basically you're going to get a lot of carbon buildup. And over 842 degrees is how that's going to self-clean as it starts to burn it up. You can also get fouling from running too cold of a plug. So let's say you have a regular Mustang, it's not supercharged, and you throw these cold plugs in it, and then all you do is drive it to work and back very lightly, then it won't get hot enough and you'll start to see it start to basically foul up here on the end. If you're running too rich of a air-fuel ratio too, so let's say the car has a real pig-rich tune on it because you got an email tune and they want it to be safe, you'll start to see these plugs start to foul up as well. And as we said in the case that you see here, you basically have oil getting past the rings, and this plug just can't keep up with it. So now what we'll talk about is we're going to go here into the gap, the ring gap, or sorry, not the ring gap, the spark plug gap here. This is a traditional gap. I think it was 50.054 is kind of the normal. And as you can see, there's a lot of room here. I can move this little wand back and forth in that. Now, the bigger the gap, as far as from factory goes, I would not increase this any, but as far as it goes, a factory gap here is what you want to keep. If you start having problems where it's misfiring, especially if you're supercharged or turbocharged, what you could be having happen is there's so much pressure in that cylinder from all the boost that it is actually blowing the flame out every time it's trying to ignite. And so what you can do to counter that is close this gap a little bit. And so as you can see here, this is a plug that I've already pre-gapped. And as you can see, it's so tight here, you can almost not even get this through here. In fact, you can't. This was actually closed a little bit tighter than 0.028, which is what I was going for. And my recommendation would to not, you should not bend this back and forth a lot, or it could eventually break. And so once I over tightened this one, I just called it a day and it was done. This plug I will not use again just for that reason. Now, once again, this gap was tightened in order for a supercharged engine. I'm at 17 psi, 600 horsepower, and I was shooting for 0.028, which is a pretty tight gap. It's almost exactly what you see here. But anyway, you want that, you want a shorter gap for that reason, but the plug may not operate normally as well. If you're sitting at idle, you might hear it misfire a little bit until you're actually in a high boost scenario where it really needs to be that tight. Then over here, basically this car was gap tight too. This is a big turbo car, and it must have lost some compression or something, which is what we found in our video, because it has oil and junk all over it. So that's just something else to consider. If your car starts misfiring, then you might want to pull the plugs and take a look at it, and they'll tell a story. Now this oil also, if it's all running down, you can sometimes have leaking valve seals. You can have oil coming around the piston rings, that kind of thing. So anyway, that's just some of the things that you can see as you start to pull plugs and diagnose. And something I wanted to point out about this is the way electricity works is it takes the path of least resistance. So you can imagine what's happening in the cylinder if, let's imagine that this part is clean enough that it is emitting a spark, but let's say this part is so gunked up that the spark is not going to basically reach this point. What it's going to do is it's going to travel to other parts on the spark plug, or worse yet, and especially if you've bent this grounding strap back and forth enough to the point where it was weak and it broke off during some detonation, then what you have is the actual electrode is shooting up and hitting the piston head on. And that's a reason why I've been it's been said not to use iridium or some of the very powerful spark plugs in your car if it's supercharged or turbocharged, because if as that piston comes up, it's going to start zapping it, and it can literally melt a hole in the top of the piston, is what I've been told. So that's something to consider, and also just remember when you're going to buy plugs, as it is common with cars, it's always, you know, people say, well, I'm just going to buy the most expensive, best thing that I can. But with plugs, that's not always the case. If you're over here naturally aspirated in, you know, a number 4, number 5 heat range plug, and the car is gonna, you plan to keep those plugs in there for 100,000 miles, and go ahead, get expensive plugs. Some cars require them, you have to have them, like my wife's Infiniti calls for them. But otherwise, you have to think strategy here. I run these TR6s in my Mustang Cobra because the car's 600 horsepower, 17 psi, and I will tell you that these plugs will most likely foul up, or, you know, their lifespan will be short before the plug itself would normally wear out. So basically, you want to buy cheaper plugs like this, TR6s, non-iridiums, and change them out every 10,000 miles. That's a lot better than going and spending $10, $12 a plug and then finding out the hard way that that plug's not going to last that long. Now, if you get into the 7 range, then maybe the plug will start to last longer, but if you have a high performance engine, it's most likely when it's being tuned, they're going to be a little on the conservative side. It's going to run a little bit rich with a lot of extra fuel on it. And then if you're just putting around in it, then you're going to have a lot of buildup, and these plugs are most likely not going to last very long. So my advice and suggestion would be to find out what your car is doing, find out how hot it's supposed to be running, and then decide which plug to go with. But I'd even consider the TR6s. They're an all-around good general plug, and unless you have problems, then just stick with basically the warmer plug that you can find for driving around normally. You know, but if your car, if you trailer it and then beat the heck out of it at the track every weekend and that's all you do with it, then a colder plug's probably your best bet. But a 6 range, it seems to be an all-around good plug. I don't have any problems with the car, how it runs or idles or drives. And if anything else too, just remember that it gives you a good excuse to get the car operating at a hot level, and then put some power into it and have a little fun with the car, and know that after your 872 degree area, you're helping the car out by burning off all of the extra carbon buildup that gets on here from the car normally running. You can pick up a wideband sensor. I have an install video on that too. That's going to tell you how rich or lean the car is running, and that's going to also help you know kind of what's happening with the plugs. And you also have additives like Torco, which is a fuel accelerator that will increase the octane, and it could change the color of these plugs as it burns in different ways. And so if you're adding anything like that, just remember your plugs may start to see a shorter lifespan. Anyway, I've spoken enough about this. It's already been over 20 minutes, so I'll cut the video short here. And if you have any questions, let me know. And if you have any other comments, go ahead and put those there and tell me what range plug you're using and why you decide to use it. Thanks for watching, guys.